I never thought being a landlord would put me face to face with my past. But that's exactly what happened the day I realized my ex was living in my apartment without me knowing it. I own a small duplex in Denver. One side I live in, the other I rent out. It's nothing fancy, but I keep the place in good shape and screen tenants carefully. After a rough breakup a couple of years back, I put a lot of my focus into making sure the rental stayed steady. I figured as long as the mortgage was covered and the tenants weren't a problem, I'd be fine. Earlier this year, a young woman named Kayla signed the lease. She was polite, had a stable job at a nearby hospital, and her references checked out. The first couple of months went smoothly. Rent came in on time, no noise complaints, no issues. Honestly, it was the kind of tenant you hope for as a landlord. I barely thought about it. But about 3 months in, small things started to feel off. I'd see an extra car in the driveway sometimes, not the kind Kayla drove. Once, when I went to drop off a package that had been mistakenly delivered to my unit, I thought I heard a voice inside, low, familiar, and too close for comfort. I brushed it off, told myself it was just a guest. After all, tenants have a right to live their lives. Still, there was a gnawing sense that something wasn't adding up. The car kept showing up at odd hours, staying overnight more often than not. I caught myself looking through the blinds like some nosy neighbor, even though I hated doing it. The worst part was how the voice stuck in my head. I couldn't place it at first, but it left a pit in my stomach every time I thought about it. That pit turned into certainty one afternoon when I came back from work early and saw him. Standing in the driveway, talking casually with Kayla, was Mark, my ex. The same Mark I'd spent months untangling myself from, the one I hadn't spoken to in almost 2 years. And now, he was standing in front of my rental unit like he belonged there. I froze before he noticed me. My first instinct was disbelief, like my brain needed a second to process what my eyes were seeing. But there was no mistake. Mark was living there, or at the very least, staying there far more than a casual visitor should. And suddenly, the whole picture clicked into place. The tenant I thought I knew wasn't the one actually living under my roof. It was him. I didn't say anything that day. I just walked straight past, nodded at Kayla, and kept going into my side of the duplex like nothing had happened. Inside, though, my chest felt tight, and my head buzzed with questions I couldn't shake. Why hadn't she told me someone else was living there? And why him, of all people? I wasn't naive. I knew tenants sometimes had boyfriends or girlfriends move in unofficially, but this wasn't just anyone. This was Mark, the man who once had a key to my life, the same one I had worked hard to shut out. That night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the lease agreement. Every clause was clear. Only the names on the lease were allowed to occupy the unit. Guests were fine, but not long-term. I wasn't being paranoid. What was happening violated the terms outright. Still, I hesitated. Bringing it up meant opening a door I had bolted shut years ago. For a few days, I tried to convince myself to leave it alone. Rent was still being paid on time, and there hadn't been any trouble. But the longer I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. It wasn't just a landlord issue. It felt personal, almost invasive. Mark hadn't just drifted back into my orbit. He'd slipped into the very walls I owned. I started paying closer attention. The car was there nearly every night. Lights flicked on and off at hours Kayla wouldn't normally be home if she was working her shifts. One evening, I caught a glimpse of Mark through the window, sitting comfortably on the couch like he'd settled in. That confirmed it for me. This wasn't casual. He was living there. You know that uneasy feeling when something is technically yours, but doesn't feel like it anymore? That's exactly how it was. Every time I walked up the driveway, I felt like an outsider in my own property. It wasn't anger that got to me most. It was the sheer audacity. Out of all the places in Denver, he'd found his way back here. I knew I couldn't just let it slide. The lease wasn't just paper, it was a boundary. And boundaries, once ignored, only got worse. The question was how to deal with it without turning my home into a battleground. I decided the first step was to talk to Kayla directly. She was the tenant on the lease, and technically, she was the one responsible. One Saturday morning, I knocked on her door under the pretense of checking the smoke detectors. When she let me in, everything looked normal enough. The place was tidy, smelled faintly of coffee, and had that lived-in comfort I expected. But I couldn't ignore the extra pair of sneakers by the door. the exact brand and style Mark used to wear. As I tested the alarms, I asked casually, "So how's everything going? Work keeping you busy?" She nodded, said her shifts were long but manageable, nothing unusual. Then I mentioned the car in the driveway. I didn't accuse, just asked if she had a roommate or partner staying often. She hesitated just slightly before saying, "Oh, that's my boyfriend. He crashes here sometimes, but it's not permanent." I didn't push further in that moment. I finished the smoke detectors, thanked her, and left. But her answer confirmed what I already knew. Mark wasn't just crashing occasionally. He had slid himself into the lease without ever signing it. Back inside my own unit, I felt that old resentment boiling up. This wasn't about jealousy. I was long past wanting him back. It was about control, about how easily he had slipped into a space I worked hard to protect. For years, I had been careful with tenants, careful with boundaries. And yet here he was, exploiting a loophole through someone else's signature. That night, I pulled the lease back out and highlighted the relevant section. Unauthorized occupants could be grounds for eviction. But eviction was messy, costly, and stressful, not to mention it would put Kayla in a tough spot when she hadn't technically lied on her application. I knew I needed to approach it carefully. The problem was, part of me didn't trust myself to stay detached. Seeing Mark again stirred things I thought I'd buried: anger, frustration, and an odd sense of being mocked. It felt like he'd found the one way to crawl back into my life without knocking on my door. I sat with those feelings for a while before deciding on my next move. If I wanted this resolved, I had to treat it like business. No personal history, no emotion, just the facts. That was the only way to take back my space. The following week, I drafted an email to Kayla. I kept it professional, citing the lease clause about unauthorized occupants and reminding her that only the listed tenant was permitted to live in the unit. I asked her to confirm in writing who was staying there and whether the arrangement was temporary. My finger hovered over the send button longer than I cared to admit. Finally, I hit it and told myself this wasn't personal. It was property management. She replied the next evening. Her message was polite but vague. She said her boyfriend visited frequently and sometimes stayed over, but she insisted he didn't live there full-time. She also reassured me that rent would continue to be paid on time. The problem was, her version didn't line up with what I saw daily. His car wasn't just visiting, it was practically part of the landscape. I considered confronting Mark directly, but I stopped myself. That would have blurred the line between landlord and ex, and I knew that was a trap. If I knocked on that door and spoke to him, the whole thing could spiral into old arguments, personal jabs, and tension I didn't want anywhere near my home. Instead, I decided to document. Each night, I noted when the car was there, how long it stayed, and when I saw him coming or going. It felt tedious, almost paranoid, but I knew that if I wanted to enforce the lease, I'd need more than gut feelings. As the list grew, so did my frustration. It wasn't just that he was there, it was the way he looked so comfortable. Sometimes, I'd catch him walking up the driveway carrying groceries, or laughing with Kayla like he'd built a new life inside the space I owned. Watching that felt like watching someone hang a painting on my wall without asking. You might think I should have just marched in and said, "You can't be here." But it's never that simple. Landlord-tenant laws in Denver lean heavily toward tenant rights. One wrong move, and I could have been accused of harassment. That meant every step had to be precise, by the book. Still, I knew I couldn't let this drag on forever. The duplex was more than just a building. It was my stability, my safeguard. And letting Mark linger there, even through Kayla, felt like letting him chip away at it piece by piece. The question I kept circling back to was this: how do you enforce rules without setting fire to the bridge you have to walk across every day? A week later, I decided to schedule a routine inspection. Colorado law allows landlords to give proper notice and check the unit a couple of times a year, so I gave Kayla the required 48 hours. She agreed without hesitation, which almost threw me off. If she was hiding something, why wouldn't she resist? When the day came, I walked into the unit with my clipboard and a tight smile. Kayla was there, but Mark wasn't. The place looked spotless, almost staged. No shoes by the door this time. No jacket tossed over a chair. I checked smoke detectors, plumbing under the sink, water pressure in the shower. anything to make it look like a legitimate inspection. But in the back of my mind, I was scanning for signs of him, and I found them. In the bedroom closet, tucked behind Kayla's work uniforms, were men's clothes, shirts I remembered from years ago, the same ones he used to wear on lazy weekends. On the nightstand, a phone charger sat next to another one identical to it. It wasn't proof that he lived there full-time, but it was enough to make me certain. Kayla chatted lightly while I made notes, like she was trying to fill the air. She mentioned her long shifts, her plans for vacation, anything except the obvious. I didn't confront her in the moment. Instead, I wrapped up quickly and left with my notes in hand, my suspicion now carved into certainty. Back in my unit, I thought about my options. I could send a formal notice demanding the unauthorized occupant leave, or I could start the eviction process if it continued. Both felt like nuclear options. I didn't want to drag Kayla through hell, and honestly, I didn't want to give Mark the satisfaction of knowing he'd gotten under my skin. But I also knew this couldn't stay hidden forever. Tenants come and go, but landlords have to live with the long-term consequences. If I let it slide once, what would stop the next person from bending the rules? The irony wasn't lost on me. I was in a power position legally, but emotionally, I felt cornered. It was like watching a chess game where every move left me more exposed. And still, the one thing I hadn't done, the one thing I dreaded, was actually face Mark. Sooner or later, I knew I would have to. The showdown came sooner than I expected. One evening, I pulled into the driveway after work and there he was, Mark, unloading groceries from the trunk of that same car I'd been documenting for weeks. He looked up, caught my eye, and for a split second, neither of us moved. It felt like time stretched just long enough for the past to rush back in. He broke the silence first. "Hey," he said, casual, like we were old neighbors bumping into each other. He even gave me that crooked half-smile I used to know too well. I didn't return it. "You're not supposed to be living here, Mark." My voice came out steadier than I felt. He shrugged, setting a grocery bag down on the hood. "I'm not living here. Just helping Kayla out, spending time. You know how it is." I almost laughed at the audacity. "Every night? Carrying groceries? Clothes in the closet?" I didn't mean to let that last part slip, but it came out sharp, almost accusing. He tilted his head, still playing it cool. "So you're checking closets now? Doesn't sound very professional." That stung, mostly because it was true. I had crossed into personal territory during that inspection. But professionalism aside, the facts didn't lie. He was living there, and he knew it. Kayla came out just then, clearly caught off guard by the tension. She looked between us and muttered something about dinner before slipping back inside, leaving the two of us in the driveway like a standoff neither of us wanted. I took a slow breath. "This isn't about you and me. It's about the lease. You're not on it, and you can't stay here like this." He leaned against the car, arms folded, as if the whole situation amused him. "You really want to start that fight? She's paying rent. Place is taken care of. What's the problem?" That was the problem. He acted like rules were suggestions, like boundaries didn't matter. It was the same attitude that had made our relationship impossible. And here it was again, showing up in my driveway, reminding me why I had cut him out in the first place. I didn't argue further. Instead, I turned and walked back to my side of the duplex. The conversation wasn't finished, but I knew one thing. If he thought I was bluffing, he was about to find out I wasn't. That night, I sat at my desk with the lease and my notes spread out in front of me. My hands itched to fire off a notice right then and there, but I forced myself to slow down. Denver tenant laws were strict, and one misstep could hand them leverage instead of me. I drafted a cure or quit notice, a formal warning giving Kayla 10 days to fix the violation or face termination of the lease. I didn't hit print yet, but just seeing it on my screen gave me back a sliver of control. The next few days were tense. Mark's car still showed up like clockwork, but now he avoided me. If I pulled into the driveway, he'd duck inside. If we crossed paths, he kept his head down. Kayla, on the other hand, was overly friendly. She waved more, asked about the weather, even offered me a plate of leftover cookies one evening. It was polite, but transparent, like she knew what was coming and hoped charm would soften it. By the end of the week, I decided enough was enough. I printed the notice, signed it, and slipped it into an envelope. Delivering it felt heavy, like sliding a chess piece that would set the next 5 moves in stone. I taped it neatly to her door, while Mark's car sat right there in the driveway. Within an hour, Kayla knocked on my door. She looked nervous, holding the envelope in her hands. "I got your notice," she said. "Can we talk?" I let her in, and she sat stiffly at my kitchen table. She explained that Mark had been staying over more because her shifts were long, and she didn't like coming home to an empty house. She promised it wasn't permanent, that he had his own place across town. I listened, but I'd heard enough excuses in my life to know the difference between truth and convenience. When she was finished, I kept my voice calm. "I'm not asking for perfection, but the lease is clear. If he's here more than he's not, that's living here. And that's not allowed without being on the lease. If you want him added, we can discuss it, but what's happening now can't continue." She nodded slowly, eyes down. For the first time, she didn't try to spin it. She just muttered, "I understand." When she left, I felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter because I'd finally drawn a line, heavier because I knew the next move was hers, or his. And with Mark, history had taught me that boundaries rarely went uncontested. For a couple of days, things went strangely quiet. Mark's car didn't appear in the driveway, and the unit next door looked darker than usual at night. Part of me wondered if Kayla had taken my warning seriously, if maybe she told him to back off. I wanted to believe it was resolved that easily, but I knew better. With Mark, nothing ever stayed clean-cut. On the third evening, I was taking out the trash when I heard the door to her unit open. Out stepped Mark, carrying a duffel bag like he'd just finished a weekend trip. He spotted me instantly. For once, he didn't smirk or act casual. He just looked annoyed. "Really?" he muttered, slinging the bag over his shoulder. "You're still trying to control my life even now?" I kept my voice level. "It's not about your life, Mark. It's about my property. You're not on the lease." He shook his head like I was being unreasonable, like the rules were some personal vendetta I'd dreamed up. "You haven't changed," he said, walking past me toward his car. The words rolled off, but they hit deeper than I wanted to admit. After he left, I half expected him to be back the next night, but he wasn't. Kayla stopped me once in the driveway to say she understood the situation and didn't want any problems. She didn't mention him by name, but the message was clear. She was choosing to keep the lease rather than keep testing me. Still, I didn't relax right away. I kept documenting, kept checking the driveway, kept waiting for his return. Old habits of mistrust don't vanish overnight, especially with someone like Mark. Each empty night felt like progress, but also like holding my breath. You ever had that sense of waiting for the other shoe to drop? That's how it felt. I'd drawn my line, Kayla had acknowledged it, and Mark had stormed off with his bag. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just about whether he slept there again. It was about whether I could finally close the door on him once and for all. The question was, would he actually stay gone? Or was this just another pause before the pushback? By the second week, the silence started to feel real. The driveway only had Kayla's car, the lights came on at predictable hours, and I didn't catch glimpses of Mark through the blinds anymore. I wanted to believe it was over, but I'd lived through enough false endings with him to keep my guard up. Then one afternoon, Kayla stopped me as I was bringing in groceries. She looked more relaxed than I'd ever seen her. "I wanted to say thank you," she told me, "for being straightforward. I didn't realize how messy it could get until you spelled it out." I nodded, unsure what to say. She went on, explaining that she had told Mark he couldn't stay over anymore. It hadn't been easy, but she said the notice forced her to set a boundary she hadn't been ready to set herself. She even joked that my timing had done her a favor. I didn't press her for details. It wasn't my business how their conversation went, only that the result was what the lease required. But hearing her say it out loud gave me a sense of closure I hadn't expected. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the same lease I'd pored over for weeks. For the first time, it didn't feel like a battle plan. It felt like what it was always meant to be, a piece of paper that protected my space. Mark wasn't in my walls anymore. He wasn't in my driveway. And most importantly, he wasn't in control of my peace of mind. You might think the story ends there, but the real shift wasn't just about him leaving. It was about me finally realizing I could hold my ground without getting dragged back into old patterns. The rules weren't just legal, they were personal. They were proof that I could draw a line and keep it standing, no matter who tried to cross it. And for the first time in a long while, my home actually felt like mine again. A month passed, and life finally settled into something normal. Kayla paid rent early, kept the place spotless, and stopped waving nervously whenever we crossed paths. Mark's car never came back. At first, I kept checking, glancing at the driveway each night like a reflex. But eventually, I stopped noticing the absence. It was just quiet, and quiet felt good. I hadn't realized how much space he'd taken up in my head until it was gone. For weeks, I'd been bracing for him to push back, to show up with some excuse or try to twist things like he always did. But when he didn't, I started to see the bigger picture. This wasn't just about enforcing a lease. It was about finally proving to myself that I could shut the door on him and keep it closed. One Saturday morning, I walked through the duplex, checking for the usual landlord things: leaks, gutters, cracks in the paint. The place felt solid, reliable. I stood in the driveway between the two units and let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. The duplex wasn't just property. It was the one thing I'd built that no one else could take credit for or take over. For years, I'd thought of Mark as unfinished business, a shadow hanging over my choices. But now, seeing the space free of him, I understood something simple. Closure doesn't always come from big conversations or apologies. Sometimes it comes from drawing a line, sticking to it, and letting time do the rest. I went back inside my own place, brewed coffee, and sat by the window. The driveway was empty except for Kayla's car, the same way it had been before everything got complicated. For the first time since buying the duplex, I felt like a landlord who could breathe, not someone fighting ghosts in their own walls. And that was enough.